Okay, hey everyone, thanks for listening. I'm just going to talk through the purpose of today's session. So this is specifically for grant recipients who have been approved grant spend in year 3, so in financial year 25-26. So that's for those of you that are under Wave 2.2 and should have gone through the annual grant fund review process and received an outcome letter, or there's a couple of you that are in Wave 2.1 with BSR properties that will have been approved as well for grant spend. But if you are unsure whether you're in that cohort or not, please do email us, because that is only applicable to a small number of grant recipients. Most people we expect only have co-funding spend in year 3. However, you will have been invited to watch this because we expect that you will have year 3 grant spend. So the reconciliation evidence review process will take place in a very similar way to previous financial years in that case. And we're just going to use this session to talk through our expectations when it comes to submission of the financial reporting template and some best practice examples of the types of evidence we'll be looking to see, and how you can kind of support the process to run as smoothly as possible over the next couple of months. So we'll just move through here. So firstly, to note, you won't be invited to begin the year 3 review process until you have completed year 2 review. So once you have completed year 2, we'll also be looking then to understand if you have finished delivery or not. Once you have sort of complied with both of those two things, you'll then be invited to submit your year 3 template. The reason for that is we obviously want you to finish your co-funding spend at the point you submit the year 3 to us, rather than doing it halfway through. As usual, any documents or communication will be sent through the Hug SHDF inbox. We ask that you keep your SPOC PSO into all correspondence, basically just keep everyone in the chain, and also try and respond on the same chain. So that's really helpful for us to see a history of the case all in one place. The period covered for the year 3 review will be financial year 25-26. So that will run from the 1st of April 2025 up until your agreed completion date. We know there are a small number of you that will continue delivery into the following financial year, so into 26-27. So that will be picked up separately, but this period solely relates to year 3 25-26 spend. You will receive an email once you've completed year 2 and delivery to ask you to submit your financial reporting template. You'll be given your own individual deadline in that email for when you need to submit, but you will be given a minimum of 4 weeks to prepare the reconciliation template. We would expect that that would be sufficient time, but if there are any specific reasons for delays, please do drop us an email to let us know as soon as possible, and just advise on the reason for the delay and sort of when you expect to be able to send that over, and we may need to escalate that for DESNZ for approval, because we don't really expect any of these deadlines to be missed. We also ask, as it's noted on this slide, that all of our requests and queries that we send through are reviewed as thoroughly as possible and responded to in full. What we tend to see that does cause a lot of delays is partial responses, or perhaps the guidance hasn't been reviewed or looked at or understood, and therefore we end up doing multiple reviews throughout the process that just increase the time taken to close this out and get to that clawback stage. So the more thoroughly you can go through the queries and respond to us in full, and the more detailed information you can provide, definitely the better. So we are going to go through an example on this session of a financial reporting template and what sort of the best practice that should look like, what kind of commentary we might expect you to include, how we expect things to tie through, etc. Just so that will hopefully reduce the number of queries we have, and we can try and get that right first time. And then if you are having any difficulties though addressing any queries we have on the reporting template, or you're having any difficulties completing the template, we do ask that you consult the guidance, and if you still can't find your answer in the guidance documentation, then just reach out and we can always try and arrange a call to just talk through that with you. There will also be a drop-in session after this one, where you can drop in for any sort of Q&A just to raise any questions you have on submitting your reporting template. So we do advise you think about joining that session as well to ask any specific questions. Okay. Just move on then. So as I said, the financial reporting template, you'll often hear this referred to as the FRT. That will include all of your spend transactions incurred from the 1st of April through to your completion date. And that will be a detailed breakdown of all of the spend incurred. There'll be 2 separate columns in the reporting template, one for your grant spend and one for your co-funding spend. So they'll need to be split out separately. At the point that we give you the deadline, we appreciate that some invoices may not yet have been submitted. So let's say you have a deadline, you have a deadline of the 12th of March, but an invoice isn't due to come in until April 2026. We would actually expect at the 12th of March that you use valuations to estimate your spend for that financial year, knowing, even though we know that invoices might come in after the date it's based on, the costs should be based on the date that the works were completed rather than the date of the invoice. So anything included in your FRT should be based on eligible work and the completion date of that work. Just note here that your grant's been claimed. It should not exceed the amount that's been agreed in your outcome letter for grant retention. So please just do bear that in mind. And then we're just reiterating here, this is also specified quite clearly in the guidance, but it's one of the things we've had quite a lot of issues with in year 2 is we need costs to be split by A&A and capital on the transaction listing. So even if you have an invoice for capital and A&A costs, rather than that one invoice be referenced on your reporting template, we'd expect that to be split out by spend type, i.e. by A&A capital, and there is a place in the template book that will show you where you will need to indicate whether the spend is A&A or capital, and then that should also be able to be traced clearly back to the supporting evidence as well. What we don't expect to see in the year 3 template is any adjustments to previous year financial reporting templates. So again, we saw a lot in year 2, people putting in negative transactions to reverse out transactions from previous financial years. Because the financial years are treated separately on the scheme, we ask that you don't do that. There will be an opportunity to send those adjustments in during the closure process. So there will be guidance separately released from DESNZ in due course on that process. But for now, we just ask you only include spend related to works actually completed during the 3rd financial year. Okay. Just move on then. I'm going to hand over to Karina just to pick up on this bit.
Yeah, hi everyone. We're just going to run through the FRT and examples of sample evidence that's provided, just to give you a bit of an idea of what to expect, although it might have already been your 3rd year of doing this, but it's just a bit more helpful guidance. So completing the FRT, the scheme guidance that we do provides all information related to eligible expenditure and classification. So whilst it's not an exhaustive list, the guidance has been developed based on frequently asked questions and past reviews. So it provides a really helpful reference point. So I'd refer you to that all the time when you're trying to decide where to classify costs as A&A, capital, or in some cases digital. There is some examples on this slide that you can have a look at, but they will all be found in the guidance as well. Move on. Thank you. Okay, so the FRT template for year 3 is the same as the year 2 template, but we'll just run through it for people that are new anyway. The transaction listing that's within the FRT, you must break down all of the expenditure in the invoices between capital and A&A. So as you can see here on the example, supplier A's invoice contained A&A costs as well as capital costs. So it's been split out onto 2 lines. And in column K, there's an explanation as to why that has happened and you just include what's included off the invoice in there. So it's very clear to the reader and for the person doing the review what they're testing and what they need to refer back to from the invoice. Then at the bottom, the colour-coded numbers are the totals. So you've got total amount in colour-coded in orange, co-funding in blue, and grant expenditure in green. The reason those are colour-coded is because on the next slide, if we go to the next slide, the FRT summary, these amounts, total co-funding and grant funding, should agree back to your transaction listing. That's one of the first checks we will do, and if that is different, we will obviously ask you to update your FRT, so it will come back to be redone. Then the detail, obviously, as you can see, it's exactly the same. So project information, expenditure split by co-funding and grant funding. And then there's the section that compares the grant funding to grant expenditure reported in the monthly reports to the end of the reconciliation period. These numbers should agree, but if they don't, please do provide an explanation in the box below. If we can move on. Okay, brilliant. So moving on to sampling, once the FRT is in a position where we can select a sample, we will do so, and we will share that with you as soon as possible. And in that email, we will ask if you can provide the evidence within 5 working days and provide a deadline for that. If that's not complied with, chasers will be sent. Where there is going to be issues with complying with the date, which is obviously expected to be a rarity, please do communicate with us. If we don't know, we will expect that that's not been actioned, so we will continue to chase. But if you do communicate with us, then we understand what the expectation is on your side and we can discuss that further. Once we've got that sample evidence back, hopefully we'll have no more queries, which would be great. But if we do, we'll send up a follow-up email. And in that follow-up email, it usually has fewer, finer detail queries. So we do allow for 3 working days for those to be turned around, because usually it's a lot less information that we're asking for in the second time round. Again, please do provide an update if you don't think you're going to meet that for holidays, for example. But again, that's by exception. And chasers will be sent if it's not received within the period. And we do have an escalation process in place. So communication really is key, just to avoid any miscommunications there. During the follow-up process, the DP will send findings and recommendations for the April review process, and then the expectation from that is that you will either action any of the recommendations that we've asked, so basically update your FRT for any classification issues, for example, or provide us additional evidence so we can close that query out. I do want to reiterate what Louise said earlier about please provide the full, address all queries in full in the response instead of partial replies, just because this speeds up the review process as opposed to doing partial reviews and having to come back in again. And if there are any issues that you think you can't fully address, please do reach out to us and we will arrange a call so we can make sure we are fully addressing it in one go. Can we move on, please? Okay, talking about supporting evidence for samples. There's a lot of things to think about, but the main requirements that we ask you to think about when you're providing any evidence. Firstly, is it clear that the nature of the service that's been provided is documented in the evidence? So there's quite a few times where we'll get evidence that will say refers to evaluation or a PO, but then it doesn't actually give the breakdown of what's actually the work that's happened, or that PO hasn't been supplied, or the valuation hasn't been supplied. So please just make sure that from the evidence you provide, even if it is an invoice and something else, we can actually see the breakdown of the costs and what they're associated with in detail. The next part is the information provided on the evidence must reconcile to the transaction listing. So the sample line that we've selected, any evidence that you provide needs to match up on the dates, although they can be slightly different. We do understand that invoices come in a bit after sometimes, but it usually should be the same. Descriptions and definitely amounts. Where the evidence you provide doesn't align or cannot be easily matched up, please do make sure you highlight or bring out that information within the, for example, valuation or invoice, so we know where we're looking. Where the evidence provided contains multiple line items, it must be made clear that how each expense has been classified. So within that evidence, which is A&A and which is capital and which is relevant to the sample. And then examples of supporting evidence that we normally see is invoices, payment certificates, and where we haven't got that, because we do appreciate that invoices come in after the period. We do accept evaluation as long as it's supported by third-party confirmation regarding the status of the work completed and the amount. The valuation alone would not be considered sufficient and would lead to further follow-up queries. So running through a couple of examples and what we expect to see matching up. So here we've got an invoice and a payment certificate. So we would be looking to, with the left-hand side of the invoice, match the supplier name and address, but the recipient name and address, the dates, the reference number, the descriptions, and the total amount. And then on the payment certificate, very similar, we'd be looking to match up the employer name and address, the site address, contract address, the job reference and the date, and the total amounts as well. If they aren't obvious and do not match, then please do provide explanations as to why and evidence, because we will raise that as a finding further if we don't have that information or we can't agree the amounts. And then valuations. So the valuation should show a clear breakdown of the work that's completed to date and how this reconciles to the amounts provided in the transaction listing. We do appreciate that valuations have a lot of information in there, and sometimes the line that we've selected is just a tiny part of that. So if you could please make clear which tab all of that information is and how it marries back and which lines are included, so we make sure we're picking up the right classification eligibility checks for that. Otherwise, again, that's another follow-on question. We're trying to reduce that back and forth and the extra admin work for yourselves as well. And then finally, moving on to internal staff costs and the evidence that we see for that. So timesheets or pay slips are usually what we see. On the left-hand side, we've got an example of a timesheet. So the timesheet should include the job title or role of the employee sampled, a clear explanation of how the rate used was calculated, strictly limited to SHDF works, this is, and any supporting calculations should be provided as well to show how we've worked out the amount of time apportioned to the SHDF project, if that's not obvious from the sheet itself. And then on the right-hand side, accompanying a timesheet, we'd need senior sign-off of the amount and the allocations of that cost towards the SHDF project. The timesheet alone wouldn't be sufficient. And then for a payslip, so the payslip provided should include pension contributions, tax, employers' NIC, and their net pay, and should be accompanied by a calculation of the percentage of the time spent on SHDF if they're not 100% employed for that purpose. If they are, please do specify that as well. Please do redact any personal information. We'd only be looking to marry up the figures that are in the sample listing, so usually get into the net pay, but it could be split out, so we have highlighted what we'd be looking to match up here.